Hello and welcome back to another episode of Oasys Top Tips. Did you know that you can perform many operations on curves in Oasys T Hiss? In this video, I'll take you on a whistle-stop tour of the operations in T Hiss and show you some of my top tips along the way. So first of all, in order to do operations on curves, we need to actually have some curves. So I'm just going to grab some new ones. So in this case, I'll take the X, Y, and Z displacements here for this is a head acceleration. I'll apply. I've got three new curves here. Next, to access operations, we click on the Operate button here, and we can see loads of operations that are available to us. There's a checkbox here to choose to copy the style from the input to the output curve. So that means that they'll have the same style as the input curve if it's checked. Otherwise, it will just take the next available styling. So to start with, I'll leave that checked, and I'm going to show you the absolute value function. This operation essentially allows us to take the absolute value, so any negative values become their positive magnitude. So the only curve here that's negative is this Y displacement curve. So I'll select that one there. You can see it's highlighted in the pane on the right. And then I'll click apply. And sure enough, it's created a new curve, which is essentially the flip or the inverted version of the original curve because all the negative values have now become positive. It's also worth pointing out a few other things. We also have the option of choosing how the new curve is created, whether it uses the highest ID plus 1, which is the default and probably the one I'd recommend in most instances, or it could use the next free curve, which is similar, but if there are some gaps in the curve tree, so say we've deleted some intermediate curves, then it will fill those in first, or we can actually have it overwrite the input curve. I wouldn't recommend this, and typically your user settings will actually prohibit this, and that's because it's useful to have the curve history, so the history of all the curves that were involved in an operation. So and if we overwrite the inputs, we've sort of lost that data. And then, of course, we could also just type in a specific curve ID, or we can select one that's already present, and that would do an overwrite. If we type in an ID, we use the hash and then the number of the ID that we want to create for the new curve. Okay, so let's show the add operation then. So here I'm going to do an add. So I'm going to pick that new abs curve, and then I need to be careful here because if I selected this curve, it would be highlighted on the right as well, and that wouldn't work because in order to add, we need to have two input curves. And so the first box needs to match up to the second box. So I'm going to just deselect one of the curves and then select it in the second box. And now we're going to be adding 2 and 4 together. Before I do that, I'll uncheck this box to copy the style, and that means that a new curve will be created with new styling. When I click apply, we can see that new curve is created, and it's conveniently on y equals 0 because, of course, when we took the absolute, basically any negatives became positive, and so the sum of these two, when we add them together, is zeros. Alternatively, instead of adding two curves together, we could have used the key in box in the second input, and that allows us to input a scalar value to add to the curve or curves selected in the first box. So in this case, we could make a selection. Let's say we select all 4 of these curves here, and then let's offset them by, let's go 500 millimeters. So type in 500 here, and then apply, and now we've got all these new curves created which have been offset. And note that because the copy style was unchecked, we have these new styles created for these curves. I'll also point out that for any new curves that are created via operations, the operation is appended to the curve label. So for example, for this curve here, we can see that curve 2 and 4 were added together, and it's the Y components that were added. And here we've added 500 to the Y component of these 4 curves. Now you're probably familiar with those first 2 operations and may even have used them yourself, but as you can see there are many operations available to us, and some of them you probably have never used before. So I don't have time to demonstrate all of them, but I will give a quick overview of the operations we have available to us and demonstrate some of the operations that might be of interest to you. In addition to performing the operation on just a single curve, we can also perform the operation on multiple curves. The behavior depends on the selection we make in each of these 2 boxes. To make it easier to see what's going on, I'm going to delete some of the curves that we've already created. Now, a useful tip is that whenever we're in operate mode, the pick curves option will be selected. So we won't be able to blank curves like we normally do by dragging over or selecting them either in the graph, or if you didn't know, you can also select them in the legend. So in order to get into the blanking mode, or the quick pick options, you can press the Q character on your keyboard, and that changes us into blanking mode or whatever we had selected in the drop down here. In this case, I can change that actually to be delete, and then I can drag over all those curves and they're deleted. As I just mentioned, I could have also selected the curve in the legend here. So because I'm on delete mode, if I select the curve here, it will be deleted. And now I'm back to just a handful of curves here. To get back into picking mode, we need to select one of these pick buttons. So either in the first or second box. So I select pick, we change back to pick mode, and now I can pick a few curves. So for this demonstration, I'm actually just going to select them from the drop down. So I'm going to select curves 1 and 2. And then if we select just a single curve, let's say we selected curve 1 in the second box, then what we'll see happen is that this curve will be added to both the selected curves in the first box. So 1 will be added to 1 and 1 will be added to 2. So if we apply, we can see that that's happened and we've got our two new curves, this cyan one and this magenta one. Let's press Q again and then delete those. And now we can repeat the operation, but this time I'm going to select 1 and 2 in both boxes. And when we click apply, we can now see that 1 has been added to 1 and 2 has been added to 2. So because we selected the same number in both boxes, they've been matched up in sequential order. Okay, let's delete those curves again. Now let's see what happens if we picked a different number, let's say 1, 2, and 3, and 1 and 2 in the next box. An error appears saying there was a mismatch between the number of curves selected. And so we can see that we either need to select a many to one mapping, in which case that single curve will be operated with all of the selected curves in the first input field, or we need to select a matching number of curves in both boxes so that they will be a one-to-one mapping. And that's what this text here is explaining. So because of that, no operation was performed and we're back to where we started with. Okay, so I've now shown you two types of operation. So the first type here, we could have selected multiple curves and an absolute would be performed on each one. So the number of output curves is the same as the number of input curves. The second type is where you have two input boxes and the number of output curves is the same as the number of input curves selected. So the input curves are always the ones that are in the first group, the first box. But we've seen that we can either select a single second input or the same number as the input curves in the second box, or we could input a key in value as well. The third type is shown in the average field. So this is where we can select many inputs, but a single output is produced. So in this case, if we selected all the curves and we did the average, then we end up with a single output, which is just the average of all those curves. And then the final type, of which there's only a single example of, is the type where we have three input boxes. So this is where we have the vector magnitude. So let's say we want to get the resultant acceleration, we could select X and then Y and Z, and we could click apply. And now that magenta field there is the resultant acceleration. So it's performed the vector magnitude. Now there is actually also a resultant button here, which would achieve the same thing, but we can make a single selection in one box. And this is an example where we have many to one. So you can see that the new curve created with the black dashes overlays the magenta curve. Okay, so those are the four types of operation selection that we have available to us, but there are a few operations which require additional inputs. For example, the clip operation requires us to define a bounding box, and we could actually select that using the button here, and then we could perform a clip. And if we select multiple curves in this instance, so let's pick, say, the curves that roughly line that box that I selected and apply, and then we probably want to blank the curves that aren't in that box. We can now see that it's clipped the curves that we selected to lie within that box that we just drew, and the coordinates of the box are shown here. Of course, we could have manually input these or used the pick options as well. But this is an example where we have an operation that requires some additional inputs. There are other operations that require these, but I don't have time to demonstrate them in this video. But I will point out a few notable operations. So the zero operation here has a few options that allows us to essentially reset a curve back to the origin. So if we selected this curve here and we zero x and y, then it will jump back to 0, 0. If we did just x only, you shift it back to the y-axis where x equals 0, and then similarly for the y only one, that would shift it down to the y equals 0 coordinate. There are also some windowing and filter options here that have different inputs required. And instead of demonstrating all of these, which would take some time, I'm actually going to show you the manual here, which has all the operations defined in a table for us. And there's some help text as well at the top just to explain some of the things I've shown you. So we've seen some of these already, the absolute and the add. We have the ability to concatenate curves, clip them, and combine curves as well. Then there's differentiation, division. We can also envelope curves. We can do correlation between curves, integration, least squared fitting. We could map a curve onto another curve's x coordinates. So this might be useful if you have a curve which has the wrong x-axis scaling, but the y values are correct. Then we can also envelope for the max and the min over a curve selection. We can sort a curve if it isn't monotonically increasing. We can do some multiplications on either the y or the x-axis. We could do normalization, which is by default between -1 and 1. We can reorder the points in our curve. So we can either reverse the order or we can flip the axes with a reverse. We can take the reciprocal of our curve. We can do the resultant, which is what I showed you there, which is similar to the vector magnitude. Some smoothing operations. We can do the square root of a curve. We can convert a curve between true and engineering stress and strain. We can do subtractions, summing, translations, the vector magnitude. Also, that works on a 2D vector, but that would be the same as essentially just doing resultant with two curves selected. And then there's some filtering and window operations available to us. It's also worth pointing out that there are even more operations than the ones I've shown you here. So we have mass operations, and these all require a single curve as the input, with the exception of atan2, which uses two curves. And these are self-explanatory mass operations where you've got your trigonometry expressions and your logs, etc. And then we have some automotive options, which are largely filtering. So these will be used when you want to post-process models and filter them. But we also have some options for doing some of the injury calculations. So this is the head injury criteria, and we've got the 3 millisecond acceleration, the exceedance plots, viscous criteria, acceleration severity index, theoretical head impact velocity, NIDGE calculations, thorax trauma index, and then some of the operations are also repeated here for your convenience because they might be useful for you when you're doing automated post-processing. And then lastly, we've got some correlation options as well. And some of these are fairly involved, so they have their own documentation as well. And perhaps in the future, I might make a top tip on using some of them. And lastly, we've got some seismic operations as well, and these are primarily to do with the displacement, velocity, acceleration and response spectrums, as well as some Fourier transform operations. Now, of course, you don't need to actually be doing a seismic project in order to use these operations. It's just that these have been grouped in under the seismic options because they typically are used in most seismic projects where you have frequency response. So now back in THIS, I'll just show you where all of those additional operations are found. So next to operate, we have maths options, which are all shown here, automotive options, and then seismic options. And each of these behave in a similar way to the operations I've shown you, where we have a single multiple curve selections, and then also some of them have additional inputs. So I hope you found that a really useful overview of the operations in THIS, and you've discovered some new operations that you maybe didn't know that existed that you can use in your own work. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next Oasys Top Tips.